We're doing this on September the 11th, 2015. This is Kay, Frances K. Plyler Fisher. She goes by Kay, and she lives in Alabama, and she came up for a family reunion, and she's agreed to share her story, her memories of having graduated in 1966, and subsequently having gone to Vietnam and served as a nurse there, and then after that working as a certified nurse anesthetist. So from here on out, by the way, for historical purposes, the standard questions that we ask alumni, Kay has graciously filled it all out and faxed it in to me in advance. So what we're going to do in this hour-long session, or we will need to cease it at about 2 o'clock, we'll kind of talk casually. I've got a lot of questions that I've got that I want you just to talk freely and tell me mostly what's important to you. We've got a lot of demographic data in here, and I'll scan those into the computer, so those will be saved. And if we come back to the point that we can reference, we'll do that as well. Okay. And I want to also, for purposes of this recording, ask you if we have your permission to share what's in here.
Yes, you do.
Okay.
When I graduated from high school in 1963, I had really wanted to go to college. I wanted to study marine biology, which is kind of unusual because I don't swim. But I thought that would be something I would really like to do. Well, my family didn't have a lot of the resources for me to be able to go to college, so that got put to the wayside. So then I started trying to think of what I really would really want to do. And I'd always thought of the idea of taking care of people. And the best way that I could think of to take care of people was to be a nurse. The only one I really ever considered to go to, and the only one I ever really applied to go to, was Charlotte Memorial. And got accepted, and actually got scholarships for the first 2 years to go to school, which was good. My family, like I say, definitely didn't have the money for me to go. So luckily my grades were good enough, so I got accepted, and started in September of 1963.
Do you remember what the tuition was like?
Oh, I can tell you what the total was for the 3 years.
What was that?
Room and board included in books, $700.
Wow.
That was it.
Yeah. I'm sure that was a lot more at the time. Felt like a lot more money.
Felt like a lot of money.
Right.
1963 to 1966, the most significant thing that happened basically in that first year was Jfk was assassinated.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, Jfk was assassinated during that November, and of course upset everybody. But I was in the hospital. I remember I had on my nursing uniform, and it was just a regular day up until that happened, and then just everybody was just so upset over it. I mean,
how did you get the news? Were there TVs in the room?
I guess I'm not really sure how we heard. Like I say, I remember being on the floor, and only thing is we heard about it, and I mean, I know we were all crying in the halls, and but that's basically all I remember of it.
President Johnson took over after that.
Yes.
And I know there were a lot of changes to health care and just general reform and with poverty and other things going on. Did that impact you guys in nursing school? Did you see changes?
Not that I remember. I do not remember anything like that. But like I say,
I'm sure our students will say the same things when they get out of school too.
I was 18 years old.
Right.
I was young, naive, and I mean, this was my first experience not being in high school, of being somewhere else other than high school. And it was just, only thing I can say is, we just took it in stride and went on with what we were supposed to do. We were students. We were supposed to be learning how to take care of people, and that's what we did.
So you lived in the dormitories?
Yes.
Right. Tell us about that.
Well, basically, dormitories were 2 students to a room. We did have of course, there were 2 beds. There were a desk along one wall, a double desk, and then on the other side was basically an area where we could do our morning things, like brushing your teeth, combing your hair, and that kind of thing. We had like a communal shower and bathroom.
I actually know that building very well. We had clinics in there for up until the last few years. They were having some clinics over there. So they had 2 exam rooms in that dressing area. I know that area very well over there.
So yeah, that was basically our room. We had a window, one end, and the beds were on either side of the window, and we had closet space on the other end for both of us, and that was basically our room.
What was the social life like in the dorms?
Well, of course
did you have someone monitoring? Did you have a house mother at that time?
Yeah, you did. We had house mothers, and they were in that front section of the old red brick building. Is the only thing I can remember.
Yeah.
We Miss Tomaszek, and she was one of them. And the annual shows the other house mothers that we had, and so she was always a big help.
Yeah.
And then of course we had monitors on each hall, each floor, students, that would kind of make sure doors were locked and all this stuff at night. So that's basically all I remember about that part. So. I don't, like I say, I don't.
That's interesting. When I heard you say that, I remember you would probably have been in school about the time that those nursing students were murdered in the Chicago area.
Was that in '65?
I was a really young person, but it was enough that I was terrified. There were 7 nursing students.
Yeah, I remember
that were killed. And
I do.
When you talked about locking the doors, it's funny because when I talked to the older alumni, that wasn't something that she remembered, so I just find that it's interesting. Things had kind of shifted, and that you had monitors that were checking
Well, I think they always did that.
Yeah, okay.
That they would just.
She talked more about sneaking out and trying not to get caught.
Right.
Well, was that happening with your class
I guess
too?
somebody tried,
Yeah.
but I mean, I never
Right.
thought about doing that. I'm thinking, no, can't do that.
What was the area around the hospital like then? I know that when the hospital was originally built in the early 40s, it was considered a suburb. What was it like in the Dilworth Myers Park area?
It was still the same. It was a lot less than it is now.
It was still kind of out in the edge of town?
Yeah, we were kind of like on the edge of town.
Okay.
To give you an example, Pineville, North Carolina was essentially, when I was growing up, we were 15 miles from Charlotte.
Now you're just part of Charlotte.
And then when I left in 1966 to go in the Army, we were about 5 miles from Charlotte. And now we are essentially part of Charlotte, and it's been that way for a number of years. So, and I mean, things have just that road coming up, I guess it's 521, I guess, normally called South Boulevard now, where the Lance Company is, makes all the crackers. That used to be out in the boonies. I mean, it was all dark through there. I would go home for on the weekends from school, and then I would come back Sunday night, and it was like dark through there. There were not a lot of build-up at all. Now, it's all built up.
So, could you drive back in and leave a car on campus back then, or someone had to drive you in?
The majority of us did not have cars. There was actually no place to park them.
Yeah, parking's still a premium around here.
Well, there was, and the only things that we had was that old. As you're looking, I mean, this building is on the back side of where I'm talking about. Over on this side was the old red brick building that was a dormitory at one time, but then there was a hall connecting it to the new dormitories that were back there. And then you had the hospital over here. And at that time, it was a 600-bed hospital. That's all we had. But they
had just built the new front. They had the curvy roof on the front.
Now,
right?
They might have, but I'm talking about from the backside in a way, I guess you're talking about.
Yeah.
And because you'd leave the dormitory and you could go in through the ER.
Right, the original front of the
original,
hospital.
In the ER right there to the left. And then they built the educational building on the other side of the dormitories.
Right.
That's all we had. And then we also had the rehab hospital across the street in front of the new educational building. And that's all we had.
And for purposes of this camera, I shared with you when we talked on the phone the other day, when you talk about being a rehab hospital being across the street doesn't exist there anymore.
I know. I noticed
yeah,
that.
They literally in the early 90s, the hospital sort of took in the street and built more hospital in the middle of it. You made me remember there was a tunnel that went from rehab to over to the main building. Don't know if you ever used that or not.
I don't remember using that. I do remember basically crossing the street and going in.
For a number of years, I had to get out of the habit finally of talking to my students about the tunnel under the street. And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, the tunnel to rehab. Oh, yeah, we know. They didn't have that concept. Because I've heard stories from women who went to school in the 40s and 50s about how they were sort of running the units, like on the nights, and, that they would just sort of hand things over to the nursing students to do. Do you feel like you were still that was still going on then, or was there a little more supervision and less that you were the unpaid staff?
If they were handing things over to students, it was probably senior students because they were preparing them to be registered nurses, registered nurses, period. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't remember anything like that. I think you're given more responsibility each year that you're in school.
But were you considered part of staffing for the hospital?
Maybe when you were a senior.
Okay.
I would think more then than any other time. As probably, if you're going to put it that way, freshmen were just workers. It was just like what I guess nursing assistants do right now, because we were learning. And so you need to learn the basics and then proceed to more. Then as juniors, you got a little more responsibility. I mean, it may be, I think then you started learning, you were on an IV team or something, or you were learning how to give meds, and they would let you give the meds and stuff. So, and then as a senior, you got to do more. You got to be more like in charge, like you were saying about maybe on nights or something, or in a unit. But basically, unit nursing is still the fact that you're on one-on-one or one-on-two, because you can't do any more than that and give adequate care. At least I don't believe so.
What kind of memorable experience? Were there any memorable patients? You probably gave me some of that in here.
Well, I basically only gave you one, but I will always remember this little elderly black lady, and she'd had a stroke, and of course she couldn't talk, and she couldn't. I think it was her right side; she couldn't move, and the nurses, when they assigned me to her, said, she's going to drive you crazy. All she does is make noise. And, I said, okay, we'll just go see what we can do. So I went in. I explained to her who I was, what I was there for, and I explained to her everything before I did it. So she would know what to expect. And so she made not one noise. And so I took care of her for 2 or 3 days, I think it was. And then I think it was a weekend or something, and I went home for, like I always do, and for weekends. And when I came back and I was on the same floor, the nurses said, boy, are we glad you're back. I said, when you took care of her, she didn't make any noises at all. She wasn't upset. She was fine. But when you left, she went back to her old ways. So I said, well, and I said, all I did was I explained everything to her that I was going to do right before I did it, so she would not be surprised, so she would know what to expect. And I said, that's all I did different. That's all I did. But see, that's part of nursing, is watching your patient, seeing what they're feeling, seeing what their needs are. That's what being a nurse is about. So I did that. And
she was very lucky you didn't become a marine biologist. That just warms my heart.
Well, but I will always remember her. I will always remember her. So, and then the one day I was on team nursing. None of my team showed up.
What happened?
Oh, it was like during the winter or something. Everybody was sick.
Yeah.
And so I had all these patients to do all the care for, because the floor was short too. They couldn't really give me anybody to help me. Right. But see, it was at a point in nursing where I had been, instructed as to what to do in those circumstances. And the main thing is planning, organization.
So how many patients do you suppose you took care of that day?
I probably took care of anywhere from 4 to 6.
Okay.
And which, I mean, they didn't give you big teams, but I mean, 4 to 6 patients, and these were patients that were usually bedridden and couldn't feed themselves and needed baths.
And this is why you're still in school too.
And this is still while I was still in school. And we had a section on team nursing, and where you got to be the boss with people under you. Well, I was the boss, all right, but I was the boss of me.
I love it. I love it.
I was the boss of me, but see, school taught me all that. I mean, they taught me what I needed to know to be able to, you know, to take, like I said, to take care of people. There was a doctor, and like I say, to me, nurses are very important because we see the patients more than the doctors do. Only time a doctor sees his patient is on rounds, and he relies on what the nurse tells him about his patient.
Right.
So there was a nurse, and she was having a hard time telling the doctor about his patient, all this, or something else was going on. I'm really not sure about everything, but he goes to the door and he says, "Get me a real nurse in here." It seems that this nurse had graduated from a college program, and what he was wanting was a nurse who had graduated from a hospital program. And I thought, okay. And that, to me, that showed the difference between nurses who just do mostly book and not a lot of clinicals, where we did a lot of clinicals. I mean, we did what you call on-the-job training. And as a matter of fact, being a hospital graduate, a 3-year program, it makes us more like what you'd call a tradesman, a trade instead of a degree. So, but to me, the on-the-job people, they do a better job. Maybe I'm a little bit prejudiced, but they do a better job.
Well, you certainly worked your way up through the ranks and are entitled to an opinion. Yeah. When did you get your cap, and what did it mean to you? I kind of want that for this part of the interview. I don't think it was anywhere in here. But what was that like? What was it like when did you have set ceremonies where you moved from one level of nursing to another?
The only thing I remember, and like I say, in September, we came in September. In November, I was in the hospital in uniform with a cap. But in that first period of time, we had all the chemistry, physics, sociology, psychology, excuse me, and anatomy and physiology and all that stuff. We had those all classes. And then, like I say, in November, I was in a cap and a uniform. So that would have been, and I'm not really sure about if we had I don't really remember a capping ceremony, but there may have been. But I do know that I got in September, and in November we had a cap.
Okay. And was there anything special? Because I know y'all had stripes that you got for the different years, right?
Well, the first year was plain. The second year we had 1 stripe, and the third year we had 2, which remained with the cap. We didn't go back to a plain cap. So the cap, to me, when I went to nursing school, I said, I want to get a cap that's real easy to take care of. Wrong.
I was going to say that wasn't this cap.
That cap was, excuse my French, a pain in the rear.
Okay.
But to do, so I always had somebody else do mine for me that was really good at it. And but it was, you know, I'm not really sure we had a striping ceremony. I do know that, you know, at the end of the start of the second year, we had 1 stripe, and at the start of the third year, we had 2 stripes. And that was basically it for the capping. And I don't really remember any, I know they would say something about a pinning ceremony. I'm not really sure what that, I don't really remember anything there.
I think that, you know, I think for most schools, they would get their pins. Did you have a nursing school pin?
Yes.
Yeah, I know. It seems like most of them would get those at graduation, like after they
that
finished
may
the
have
program.
That may have been when it happened. Yeah.
So at what point was that desegregated? I know there were 2 hospitals. There was a black hospital and a white hospital in Charlotte up until a certain point.
I don't remember there being a separation.
Okay.
when I was in school.
Okay.
I do not remember any of that.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember growing up and there being, if you stopped at like a service station or something, they had different water supplies for one or the other. You know, one for the whites, one for the blacks. But I grew up that little town of Pineville. I mean, we never locked doors, we never locked windows. The streets were safe, and there were plenty of blacks around. We did have segregated schools, though.
You know, were there black nurses in your nursing program?
No. We had no blacks, no Hispanics. The only ones different we had were males. When I grew up, I didn't grow up to be, you know, prejudiced against anybody. I was always taught to accept everybody for who they are and what they could do. And as long as they did their job and they, you know, they got along with other people, I was fine with it. I mean, and it's still the same way.
And at what point did you decide that and why did you decide that you were going to go into the nursing corps? Was it about getting the loans paid off, or what motivated you to join the Army?
Well, what motivated me to join the Army was that my parents didn't have the money for me to pay for my last year of school here.
Okay.
And the Army would. And while I was in school, I was actually in the Women's Army Corps, so that they paid me a private's pay to go to school.
Did you have to do drills or any weekend obligations?
Nothing.
You just signed up?
I just went to school. And the only obligation I had was 2 years to serve for them when I got out.
Okay.
And so, essentially, you know, I did not have to pay for any of my nursing school. But yet, the opportunities were there for me to be able to go to school. Like I say, scholarships the first 2 years.
Right.
And then the last year the Army paid for, which basically took care of everything. And like I say, it was amazing because for 3 years of education, and at that point, Charlotte Memorial Hospital School of Nursing was probably one of the top-ranked diploma schools in the state. $700, room and board included, books included.
Wow.
And all you had to do was learn how to take care of people. So right after I graduated in June, I worked here at the hospital, evening shift, until I took the state exam. And that was a 2-day affair in, I think it was Raleigh. And so then after I passed it, that was when I went into the Army. And so I went into the Army in August. And went to Fort Sam Houston, Texas for a little brief, you know, officer basic, they called it. And so then I
So what rank did you go in at?
I went in as a second lieutenant.
Okay.
And so whenever I got through with officer basic, I went to my first duty station of Fort Polk, Louisiana. Fort Polk, Louisiana is out in the middle of a national forest. Out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
But I went, that's where I worked. We wore, of course, white uniforms and the Army cap, which is a whole lot easier than this one that we have from the school. And so we wore those on duty, and I worked just like on general floors, you know, nothing, you know, out of the ordinary, nothing like the OR or anything like that. And so then...
What kind of patients were you seeing? Were you seeing people coming
soldiers
back from Vietnam? Or,
well, we saw, you know, regular soldiers that were on
people
post.
on base, okay.
And it was a training post
Okay.
for soldiers. And so we would take care of them. We would take care of, if there were any coming back from Vietnam at the time, we would take care of them also. And so then one evening in December, I met my husband. He was Army engineer officer, and as he tells everybody, I picked him up in a bar. But it was actually the Officers Club happy hour on a Friday night. So I met him at the end of December. We were going to get married in August of the next year, but he had, because he got orders to go in the month of August that we were going to go. But I had applied for OR school, to go to OR school. But then when he got orders to go to Vietnam, I changed mine. And I said, because back then you knew that everybody that went over there, when they came back, they were changed. And I said, I don't want you going over there and changing without me. So I applied and asked for a transfer to there and canceled the OR school and went to Vietnam with him. So we got married in June 3rd, 1967. And we went to Vietnam in August. And I was at a hospital, a regular hospital in Saigon, Vietnam. And we wore white uniforms and a cap and all that. And took care of just whoever. We were only a 91-bed hospital. I think it was.
So this is an American hospital then?
Yes, it's an Army hospital.
Okay.
It was an Army hospital in, it was 17th Field Hospital in Saigon. And the nurses' quarters were right across the street, but since I was married, we had quarters about 5 blocks down the way. And so then the Tet Offensive occurred. That was in 1968, February 1968. And that was the offensive where they tried to take the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and anything else they could get a hold of. So we were, since we were only minor illnesses, we had an OR there, we took care of, we did surgeries, hernias and appendixes and that type of stuff. And so that was our main thing. Well, whenever the Tet Offensive occurred, we had a big, what they call a boulevard on front of the hospital, and so we were landing choppers in the street for casualties and stuff. And we got the majority of casualties from the U.S. Embassy there. And so then they decided that they were going to move that hospital north. They were going to and see, that was the place where they sent most of the married nurses, that their husbands were over there too.
Right.
So they sent us all to the same hospital. And I'll tell you a funny story about what happened whenever the Tet Offensive was over. I had to stay at the hospital for 9 days and couldn't get back to my quarters. And so the chief nurse said, if you want to get back to your quarters, because they would have a driver pick us up every morning and take us back every evening, said, if you want to get back to your quarters, your husband's going to have to provide the way to get back. I told my husband, he said, okay. He drove up in this Jeep that had, I think it was, I'm not sure if there were 50 caliber machine guns on it, guys hanging everywhere, flak jackets, steel pots on our heads. We went back to the quarters. That's the way I got back to my quarters. Because she said, they'll provide the transportation. I said, okay. So, and we had, in a 5-block length of street, we had 5 barricades that we had to go around to get to the quarters. And our quarters were in the Chinese district of Saigon. And the neat thing, which really scared me after it was all over, was at the end, right before we were due to come back to the United States, we were told, do you realize if they caught any medical personnel, they could sell you to the VC for $500 US.
Wow.
And while we were there, we had to destroy everything. IV bottles we had to smash, tubing we had to cut into pieces, needles we had to bend or break off. Anything that we thought that they could use, they would go through the garbage and take it out and reuse it on their people. So then whenever they moved the hospital, I went to another hospital, which was probably about 15 miles northeast of Saigon, called Long Binh. And I went to the 24th and Vac Hospital. That's the old-timey Quonset huts with we wore fatigues and combat boots and that type of stuff, and took care of, I was on the minor wounds ward.
Did you bring pictures with you?
I brought a few pictures, but they're not anything, I'll show them to you. But we were there until August, when we came home in August. We observed our first year of married life in Vietnam, our first anniversary. My husband threw a party. Everything, all that kind of stuff was like champagne and liquor and cigarettes were all rationed. And he was with the supply depot over there, engineer supply depot. As a matter of fact, he designed the new one that was built at Long Binh, or was in on the designing of the new one and helped build it. So we had pink champagne, and we had, I think it was steak and lobster tails
Wow.
that he came up with, and we had a great party. He got my chief nurse drunk. That was really cute to see, because with the pink champagne and everything, he kept filling up her glass, and she would say, no, 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 no. She'd turn her head away, and he'd fill it back up again. So, but that was really cute. So, but all in all, I spent 11 months and 24 days over there. We were in Quonset huts.
Okay.
That's a pretty stationary building.
Mm-hmm.
It could be moved if it had to be.
Right.
But it was a building that had a rounded roof with the eaves that came in like this, and the rest of the building was here. The windows were kind of underneath
Right. Right.
for ventilation and stuff. On concrete pads, and we wore combat boots and fatigues. There were times that you would be attacked. I mean, it was especially at the second Long Bend Hospital, 24th Vac. It was just a big, huge, sprawling army post that, you know, some of the buildings were more stationary than others. Like I say, ours were, I mean, it wasn't purely a tent facility. But, you know, we were still under attack. I mean, anybody and everybody could be a Viet Cong, because one of the barbers in the barbershop happened to be one. Viet Cong, he would cut hair during the day for the soldiers and everything. He would go out at night as a Viet Cong. The only reason we know, they found him dead one morning after an attack.
Wow.
So, it could be...
This was the guy that was shaving them and... Wow.
Yes. So, I mean, it could be anything, anybody. And if you had an alert, like any incoming rockets or anything, they would, because there was an officer's billet that was rocketed, and there were fatalities from it, because they just happened to be in a place where one of those rockets could reach. And the ammo dump, they was trying to get the ammo dumps and with rockets and everything, and so we had to be very careful. And they were, I hate to say this, but there was a lot of stealing from the U.S. government. I watched one day as they were at the mess hall where my quarters were on there, on the post at Long Bend. You could see the mess hall, and they would be, whenever the women would leave or anything, they would be throwing all the fruits and vegetables into a dump truck that they were trying to get out of there. My husband worked in a supply depot, and there was a lady, a Vietnamese lady, that tried to get out of the post or that facility with 150 wrenches taped to her body.
Gosh. I can't even imagine.
So, you know, that went on.
Were you ever in a place, because I'm remembering scenes from war, you know, from war TVs, and where you were trying to get patients evacuated, where you were trying to, where the hospital, where the patient care area itself was in jeopardy?
Actually, no.
Good.
Don't remember any of that. I do know that, you know, if we had to, we could have.
Right.
But there was another big hospital in Saigon, which was Third Field, which was on Tan Son Nhut Air Base. So we could have, you know, evacuated there if we had to. But basically, you know, we didn't have to do any of that. It was, again, it's the idea of being young and naive and not, you know, just eyes wide open and not expecting anything bad.
Yeah.
Which it could very well have been. That I was just a regular nurse for about 10 years.
Right.
Went to anesthesia school.
Soon,
Anesthesia school in 76, graduated in 77, at the end of 77, for a 2 full-year program. And again, that was a diploma school. So I have wound up with no degrees, but yet I have had
a wealth of knowledge.
But a full and active career.
Wow.
So I spent 34 years as a CRNA.
Retired. Okay. That's the ultimate graduation.
Retired in January of 27th of 2012. And so it's just been a totally interesting career. And I couldn't have had a better basic education.